Thank you. Our next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 19208 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a revision to today's business and Thursday's business. And could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
That is moved. There's no member asking to speak against this motion. And by the way, the motion brings forward decision time till 5:15. So the question is that motion 19208 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to topical questions. Our first question today from Angela Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it will support the Paediatric Programme Board to ensure that the return to a 24/7 service at the Children's Ward at St John's Hospital happens as quickly and safely as possible.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
As I know the member will agree, the key factor in the full reinstatement of this service to 24/7 is patient safety. Since the RCPCH review in 2016, NHS Lothian have recruited an additional 16 staff, but at the same time, as happens across our NHS, 3 staff have left to take up posts elsewhere and a further 3 are on reduced hours or extended maternity leave. The current staffing means that 32 of the 40 out-of-hours shifts needed to reach 24/7 delivery can be covered. So more recruitment is needed. I remain committed to a full 24/7 service and continue to actively support the Board's efforts to achieve that.
Angela Constance.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, West Lothian parents are deeply disappointed, not least because they face yet another winter travelling to Edinburgh with their wee ones at the weekend when they could and should be cared for locally. But they are nonetheless determined to see both the Scottish Government and NHS deliver on their commitments. So will the Cabinet Secretary commit to meet with parents to say what is now different about the plan she had outlined and when we can expect a 24/7 service at the Children's Ward?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to the member for that additional question. I absolutely understand the disappointment faced by parents in West Lothian. These are families with a sick child, and this is an additional worry and an additional burden for them when they had hoped that this would be the winter when they did not have to undertake that additional journey. Of course, I would be very happy to meet the families concerned, and I'm grateful to Ms Constance for any support that she can offer in arranging that.
Angela Constance.
Cabinet Secretary, I have asked repeatedly about the support and scrutiny of the Paediatric Programme Board in delivering a 24/7 children's ward service. And with the challenges in paediatric inpatient services across the Lothians, I wondered if the Cabinet Secretary agrees that given that we have a first-class children's ward, that providing more services in West Lothian could not only help anchor a 24/7 service at St John's, but also benefit the region as a whole.
Cabinet Secretary.
I do very much agree with what the member has just said. I think an important point that she has made is that we have in St John's a first-class and undoubtedly much-loved children's ward. I'm well aware of the growth in the area that St John serves and the nature of that population growth, many families with young children. I fully expect NHS Lothian to consider the Lothian-wide delivery of paediatric services, both in hospital and community, and that means giving active consideration to the design and delivery of services. And I've asked the Chief Medical Officer to engage directly with NHS Lothian on this, looking across the entire estate at how we can, both for this winter and the coming months, but in the longer term, make sure that both areas of the estate are actively and properly resourced and used to meet the populations that they serve.
Thank you. We have a number of supplementaries. The first from Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following promises from the Cabinet Secretary in January that this 24/7 service would be reinstated in October, families will indeed be bitterly disappointed that they've been let down yet again. It's not been a good year for NHS Lothian. Can the Cabinet Secretary guarantee that this paediatric service will be fully reinstated by the end of 2019?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Ms Lennon for that question. Just for the record, can I make it clear that from the record, when I made the statement in January, I was very clear that it wasn't a promise but a commitment, because I am not personally in charge of staff recruitment. And of course, I have asked NHS Lothian to over-recruit in order to ensure that they can take account of instances like long-term sicknesses and so on, and all of those play a big part in the rota. At this point, without further detailed discussion with NHS Lothian about what other opportunities they can take up in terms of advanced nurse practitioner training, which, as Ms Lennon will recall, is a significant part of what makes a sustainable rota. They have recruited consultant posts that are hybrid, as they describe it, i.e. they work across both Edinburgh and St John's, so there may be more to do there, and there may be more to do in terms of existing staff who are prepared to take on additional hours in a sustainable long-term way, not a short-term way, as well as recruitment. So with the Chief Nursing Officer, Chief Medical Officer and myself, we will look in considerable detail at what are the specific plans, in addition to what I know and have outlined, Lothian now intend to take forward, and what more we will require them to take forward. And on the basis of that, I would feel in a more confident position to be able to indicate exactly when I think they will be able to reach that full 24/7 position. But I restate my commitment is absolute to getting to a 24/7 provision in that children's ward in St John's, but also taking up Ms Constance's point, making sure that we maximise the use of St John's in terms of paediatric services.
Jeremy Balfour, to be followed by Neil Findlay. Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, President Officer. Could the Cabinet Secretary then confirm when she'll be able to come back to this chamber and give us an update, and more importantly, give parents an update as to when this service will be available? And would she work with NHS Lothian and other colleagues within Scottish Government to look at the transport issues that parents face getting back to West Lothian, particularly on a Sunday night where there's a limited number of public transport, and what provision can be made for them so that they can visit and also be able to get back to their homes at the same time?
Cabinet Secretary.
So just on the question of transport, my understanding is that NHS Lothian had offered additional support to families who had to travel into Edinburgh Sick Kids, and then in order to help them return. But if that is not the case, then I'm happy to look at that again, or to look at what more they might do and raise that directly with them. In terms of when I think I would be able to come back to this chamber and update them, that is actually a very difficult question for me to respond to directly, but what I will make a commitment to doing is updating members at the start of November on what progress we have made in this month.
Neil Findlay, to be followed by Alison Johnson. Neil Findlay.
Cabinet Secretary, I hope you can see this copy of the West Lothian Courier from February 2012 with the headline "Staff Crisis in Kids Ward." This shambles has gone on for 7 years and it is still not resolved. The Cabinet Secretary said that the Paediatric Board met at the end of August and made a decision not to reopen on a 24/7 basis in October. So why has it taken from the end of August until the end of September, a month later, to make this public? Was it just a coincidence that NHS Lothian had to reply to a letter that I sent them about this last week, and that's why there was a government question set up by Angela Constance to give the answer that was given? Is it any wonder the public have little faith in NHS Lothian and the Cabinet Secretary when we see a shambles at St John's and an even greater shambles at the Sick Kids Hospital?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I completely understand Mr Findlay's anger at this matter. It is not the case that there was suddenly a government flurry of activity because he'd written a letter. The programme board did make that decision at the end of August, but what we did was question that decision and look further at it. Now, Mr Findlay, you may be cynical and sceptical about that, but that does not alter the facts of the matter. You would expect me to query what a board is telling me they can't do when what they can't do is what I have made a commitment that I need them to do. So, of course, I go back and query that. Otherwise, I would be failing in my responsibilities as a Cabinet Secretary. I don't think, presiding officer, is overly helpful for me to be clear in this chamber if a member insists on continuing to shout at me. I am trying to make sure that members are kept up to date here. I don't know, Mr Finlay, how well you know Ms Constance, but trust me, setting up Ms Constance to do anything is a very unlikely circumstance. She asked a question quite legitimately as the constituency MSP, as you have a legitimate locus in this matter. There is no conspiracy, there is no attempt to keep matters from this chamber. That is not my way, and it hasn't been the case here. More importantly, it is not my way to keep information from families whom this directly affects, and that is why we have made this clear and why I will take up Ms Constance's offer to meet the families that I met before and hear from them what they need me now to do.
Alison Johnson, to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you. Given the well-publicised difficulties, the challenges facing the Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh, can the Cabinet Secretary outline what support has been given to nearby hospitals who are treating patients diverted from St John's? And the Cabinet Secretary has previously said that staff leaving their posts is, that's contributed towards the delays. Can the Cabinet Secretary clarify what steps are being taken to ensure that staff well-being is prioritised at the hospital at St John's? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Ms Johnson for her question. A number of steps are being taken in terms of the existing Sick Kids Hospital at Sheens, which Ms Johnson is aware of, in terms of staff and the services continuing there whilst we ensure that the new site is safe and fit for purpose. That includes additional support to staff in the sick kids, as well as other matters in terms of the building and facilities and so on. But that is also in addition to the answer that I gave to Ms Constance in terms of looking at a Lothian-wide paediatric service that maximises the use of all the resources at that board's disposal. And indeed, it was when I visited the staff at Sick Kids last Monday that I had the opportunity to hear from one of their senior paediatric consultants about how he wished to make sure that St John's capacity and resource and the quality of service there was maximised. In terms of what is offered to staff at St John's on their mental health and well-being, that is, as I would expect NHS Lothian to be doing, as I expect any other boards. But if Ms Johnson wishes, I will make a specific inquiry as to whether they are taking any other additional steps and advise her of that.
And Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, you said in January this year, I will ensure that month by month we make the progress that we need by end of October. So what lessons have you learned from this experience, given that, as Neil Finlay outlined, we have had years and years and years of understaffing problems at St John's, which have not been successfully resolved? And you've not been able to give a commitment in terms of time today. So what will you do to make sure that this will be fixed? Your opening answer to the question seemed to me totally unsurprising in terms of numbers of staff moving on. Surely we have to expect that these days and plan the additional staff capacity to give the hospital the number of staff, that hard-pressed staff existing who are there already and the patients urgently need.
Cabinet Secretary.
So Ms Boyack is absolutely right that part of what you do in planning a sustainable rota is fit in questions that you can anticipate, such as staff leaving, but also holiday entitlement and sickness absence. What you cannot plan for is long-term sickness absence that does not begin that way, or long-term maternity leave that does not begin that way, or staff moving who have made commitments to a particular service, but then for entirely reasonable, and they are entitled to do this, reasons, decide that there are opportunities elsewhere that they wish to take up. That may be for personal reasons or domestic circumstances. But that is why what I have asked Lothian to do and continue to ask them to do is to over-recruit, to not recruit to the numbers that they think they actually need for a 24/7 service, but to over-recruit if they have the numbers coming forward in a recruitment exercise. So that is the approach that we are taking. We do track it month by month, and we will continue to do that in order to meet the commitment that I've made.
Thank you very much. Question to James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the HMICS report into the Scottish Police Authority, including the finding that it has no clear vision, strategy or plan in place.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
The SPA has developed and is in the process of implementing a significant programme of improvement, with the HMICS thematic inspection finding evidence of genuine progress at the SPA over the last 18 to 24 months. This includes the appointment of experienced and talented individuals to the SPA board and Police Scotland's leadership team. However, of course, I recognise, as does the SPA, that the improvement journey must continue. The report helpfully highlights key areas of focus going forward, a number of which SPA have already begun to address. The Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland publish their 10-year plan on policing strategy in June 2017. This set out the long-term plan to build a sustainable, modern and flexible police force. That will have to be refreshed, that strategy, at the start of next year. This will take account of the strategic policing priorities which set the overarching framework for policing in Scotland. And Scottish Government consultation on these priorities closes on Friday.
James Kelly.
Thank you. In listening to the Cabinet Secretary's response, I wonder if he was reading a different report from the one that I read, because the verdict was damning. There were serious flaws in governance, namely that the chair and a number of board members were acting well out with their core non-executive roles. There was a lack of rigour in the SPA in holding the Chief Constable to account, and there was also a conflict of interest at the core of the SPA. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, why has there been a complete failure by the Government to highlight and manage these serious problems highlighted in the HMICS report? And also, will he set out a clear plan with a timeline to address the specific recommendations set out in the report?
Cabinet Secretary.
I mean, I do genuinely question whether or not James Kelly read the report in full, because he paints one picture of it. Now, I have said in my opening remarks, of course I recognise the SPA has some improvement to make. There's simply no doubt upon reading HMICS's report. But the report also says, and I could read reams of quotes, I won't, of course, because of brevity of time, but certainly the HMICS, the inspector, says the current SPA chair and board members bring a wealth of experience and skills from a range of professional backgrounds that can be usefully brought to bear on the governance of policing. On a substantial point, though, on the question around the exec versus the non-exec space, I think it's a very good question and a very serious question to ask. That's why in my immediate response to the HMICS report last week, I said that we have agreed jointly with SPA to look at the organisational framework, to look at the governance and accountability framework. And of course, in terms of the review, the timescales associated to that review, I will of course keep James Kelly and other members of the Justice Committee and indeed Justice spokespeople up to date on that.
James Kelly.
Thank you. So in terms of setting the culture and tone of an organisation, the leadership roles are important. Bearing in mind the Cabinet Secretary's first response, does he accept that it's unacceptable for the chair and a number of board members to be acting out with their non-executive roles? And will he set out an immediate timeline for reviewing those roles to ensure that the chair and the board members carry out their work appropriately?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I have said to James Kelly, of course, I will give him details of that review that SPA has agreed to do in terms of that review, which will absolutely look at the exec versus non-exec space. Of course, the SPA board does operate within the on-board principles, but equally, I think every one of us, in fairness, would recognise that the SPA has a very unique role in terms of both scrutiny, in terms of the Chief Constable, absolutely, and also, of course, when we look at forensics, in some relation, the delivery of some policing functions as well. It's also worth me saying as well that while I take very seriously what James Kelly is requesting, and we will do that review, there is a fine line. SPA was created, in essence, to be that buffer between, of course, operational policing and the government, and that's quite right. I'm happy to work jointly with the SPA to do that review, but I certainly won't be stepping into a space where James Kelly would be accusing me of interfering on the one hand and at the same time telling me to get myself involved. He would be the first person to be telling me that I would be interfering. And the very last point I would make is that I think even the harshest critics of the SPA would recognise the tireless hard work that the chair, Susan Deakin, somebody well known, I'm sure, to James Kelly, has done in this space. And I think SPA, of course it has to improve, will improve, but is in a remarkably better place under her leadership than perhaps previous.
Liam Kerr to be followed by John Finney. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, a large part of the controversy surrounding the SPA was to do with meetings being held in private with no chance of public scrutiny. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell us the SPA's current policy on holding meetings in private?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, he's right to make that point that previously there was criticism of the SPA for holding the meetings in private, but I think it's absolutely right to say that Susan Deakin, under her leadership, has brought a much more open and transparent, as well openness and transparency to the SPA, and in fact that's recognised by HMICS's report. She talks about the fact that SPA has made a number of changes and improvement over the last 18-24 months to improve the overall systems of governance, including a revised committee structure, a new governance framework, standing orders, and scheme of delegation. In terms of his specific question around the SPA, that would be a matter to raise directly with the SPA, but I certainly know from my conversations with Susan Deakin that where the SPA can be open, public and transparent, they of course will be, with the understanding of course that all of us have that there will be some matters that clearly need to be discussed that are sensitive in private.
John Finney to be followed by Shona Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware of the passage that says some local authorities remain concerned that national policy decisions that impact locally are not the subject of effective engagement and consultation, and that there is a disconnect between local scrutiny and the SPA board. Given that that was a key feature of the maintaining the relationship, a local engagement on policing issues, what steps will he take to resolve that very important matter?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I have to say, the chair of the SPA, myself and the Chief Constable in our regular meetings, all of us are committed to that local accountability and that further evolution of policing into to local communities. In fact, I'm sure he's heard the Chief Constable himself say on many occasions that policing is only by consent and consent of the people, and therefore having people involved is hugely important. I can see John Finney pointing to the report. The issue around governance is highlighted on page 5 of the report. HMICS, the Chief Inspector, says the SPA has improved its visibility and engagement with local authorities, but also crucially, and this is his point, recognise the need to improve its overall approach. So I will take away, of course, what the report says. Some of the recommendations are for government. Equally, most of them are for the SPA. And of course, the local accountability is an important point that is not lost on any of the triumvirate that are involved in policing.
Shona Robertson to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
While most of the recommendations in the report are, as the Cabinet Secretary said, for the Scottish Police Authority to take forward, will the Scottish Government commit to considering its role in delivery, including providing ongoing support to the authority to address these issues? And does the Cabinet Secretary also think it's important to recognise findings from the Justice Committee's post-legislative scrutiny report, which found that more equal access to specialist support and national capacity was a success story and has particularly benefited victims of crime, such as domestic or sexual abuse?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do. I think it's a hugely important point, but by Shona Robinson, those that represent particular victims of these terrible crimes, particularly rape and sexual offences, well, of course, calling for further improvement and their right to do so, we have also said very publicly on the record that the investigations under Police Scotland for these terrible crimes is at a better place nationally than it was perhaps in previous legacy forces. So that's an important point by Shona Robinson, but none of that takes away from the fact that this report, I don't doubt, makes for sobering reading. The recommendations will be taken forward absolutely that are for government. And of course, SPA will reflect on the majority of the findings which are for them, and I will continue to keep the Justice Committee updated on our progress.
Liam MacArthur to be followed by Gordon Lindhurst.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This very much feels like Groundhog Day. How, more than 6 years into the existence of SPA and almost 2 years into the tenure of Susan Deakin, can there still be, quote, fundamental conflicts of interest and so much confusion about who does what and where the boundaries lie?
Well, some of that, and I think even Lee MacArthur would have to accept this, that SPA does have a very unique function as an organisation in statute. You know, it is, of course, while still abiding, and I stress this point, by the on-board principles that exist, it does have a very unique function in terms of the scrutiny of the police and the dual role that it has in terms of supporting policing. But I would say to Liam MacArthur, you know, I listened intently to his contribution on the police and fire reform debate that was taking place in this chamber just a few weeks ago. And I'll quote from him direct, so I'm not misquoting, of course. And he said, quote, "Susan Deakin, for whom I have the utmost respect, is due considerable credit for many of the reforms that she has introduced since she took over as the chair of the SPA," end quote. So, I think that all of us could recognise, as Liam MacArthur clearly has from his quote, that Susan Deakin, I think, has done an excellent job in driving forward some really impressive change in the SPA. His wider point is around what else has to be done. Well, there's very clear recommendations, I think, from James Kelly's question around the exec, non-exec space. We'll do a review around that, plus other governance issues, and I'll promise to keep him and the rest of the Justice Committee informed of that progress.
And Gordon Lyndhurst.
A recurring theme identified is the limited ability of the SPA board to recognise issues of public interest and hold Police Scotland to account when it comes to community policing. How will the Scottish Government increase the effectiveness of the SPA board to recognise those issues of community policing, or how will it move that particular issue forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, again, we'll look at the recommendations carefully, and clearly the local element is hugely important to all of us. What I would say is that my view of local policing, the feedback is very, very positive. Now, that's not just from me. I was reading with interest a letter into the Greenock Telegraph on Monday, the 12th of August, from Councillor David Wilson, who's a Conservative councillor, not an SNP councillor, a Conservative councillor. And he says here, and I quote from him directly again so that I'm not misquoting, he says, "I can only comment on the quite unanimous feedback from my constituents that they feel securer than in the past, and often comment on the visibility of our police." And really, really positive for somebody who's on the ground, in this case, in Greenock. So I think we're making positive progress in relation to policing at a local level, but that's not to take away from what HMICS has said and what Gordon Lyndhurst and others have said around the local element. So we'll take forward those recommendations. And again, I will keep members who have an interest in this updated on our progress.
Thank you very much, colleagues. That concludes topical questions. We're going to turn to our next item of business, which is a public audit and post-legislative scrutiny committee debate on motion 19160 in the name of Jenny Mara on post-legislative scrutiny Control of Dogs Scotland Act 2010. I would encourage all members who wish to contribute to this debate to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on Jenny Mara to speak to and to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by moving the motion in my name? And on behalf of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss the committee's scrutiny of the Control of Dogs Scotland Act 2010 with colleagues from across the chamber and across parties this afternoon. In May 2018, this chamber debated a motion by Alec Neil MSP, a member of the committee, calling for post-legislative scrutiny of the 2010 Act. After hearing stories from other members of the committee of out-of-control and dangerous dogs throughout Scotland, the committee unanimously agreed that it was